Thank you all so much for being here today, for hanging out with us. Whether you're joining us on campus or if you're watching online, just grateful that you're here. I don't know if you saw this yesterday. If you follow us on social media, we put out a thing that we have a big announcement today that we're going to share at the end. And I'm just reminding you of that because I know sometimes you're like, man, I want to get out of here early and beat the traffic, or I want to get to the restaurant. We're going to share it at the end, which I know is kind of messed up because you're like, why are you talking about it now? Because you're going to have to stay till the end if you want to hear it. And it is really good, so you're going to want to hang around. Today, though, we're also excited. We are continuing the series we've been in a while through the book of Romans. And just as a side note, if you're at all curious about the book of Romans, or even maybe you've been here as we've been in Romans for a while now, or if this is your first time and you're interested in what we're talking about today, we are starting a growth track through the book of Romans, which growth track is a thing that we do online. And so it's a way to engage with other people here from the church. There's a couple of Zoom sessions we're going to do that I'll join in for a Q&A, just kind of discussing Romans and talking about Romans. And so if you want to be a part of that, it starts tomorrow. You can go online to FCCHB.com. Actually, if you go to FCCHB.com/recap, there's a link there, and you can sign up for that and be a part of that. It's totally free. It's easy, but it's just a chance to look a little bit deeper at Romans. So if you're at all interested, I encourage you to check it out. I think it's 4 weeks long. You won't regret it. But we are continuing this journey through the book of Romans. And Romans it's actually a letter that the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Rome. And it's in a lot of ways considered like his masterpiece of a letter. The New Testament has a bunch of books that are letters, and a lot of them are written by Paul, but Romans is kind of considered his theological masterpiece, because what he does in the first 8 chapters of Romans is he gives like the most thorough explanation that we have in the New Testament, just really of the Christian faith. He kind of lays it out like this is what Christian faith was all about, and so it's all kind of theological. When you get to chapter 9, he begins to transition toward the more practical part of his letter. And I would ultimately say that's really the point of what he's going to try to get across, is he spends the first 8 chapters kind of making this argument, and then he says, and this is how we should live now. Because of this, because all this is true, this is how we should live. And so today we're starting in chapter 9. So we're at that kind of transition point where Paul's going to begin to move toward the more practical part of the letter. And he's going to do it by first addressing something that is very personal to him. Paul is actually known as the apostle to the Gentiles. That's kind of the title that he's given. In fact, he'll call himself that in Romans chapter 11. Now, the reason that he's given that title is when you look at like kind of the origin of the early church and where the church came from, is the church was born out of Jesus and his work and his movement that he started. But Jesus and all his closest, earliest followers were all Jewish. And so the church, what then becomes known as Christianity or Christian faith, is born within Judaism. And it actually takes a while before people even recognize, oh, this is different. It's not Judaism. It's a totally different thing. And so the early church is strictly a Jewish church, but Jesus makes it very clear that, like, hey, this was never just for Jewish people. And so Jesus does some things in his life to cross some of those boundaries, and he reaches out into the larger Gentile world. A Gentile is just really anyone who's not Jewish. And so kind of in the Jewish mindset in the first century, there was Jews and there was Gentiles. And so Jesus does some things to kind of try to break it out of its Jewish roots and to engage a larger Gentile world. Some of his followers do a few things here and there to break it out, but Paul's the one that's most responsible for getting the church largely out into the Gentile world. Paul is actually selected. Jesus, after his death and resurrection, Jesus kind of like speaks to him on the road and said, hey, this is what you're going to do. And so Paul's a guy who will spend the rest of his life then traveling throughout the Roman Empire, going to largely Gentile cities and talking about Jesus and starting churches and starting Gentile churches. Now, the thing to remember about Paul, though, is even though he's known as the apostle to the Gentiles, and that's like his life work, he himself is a Jew. He has really good Jewish credentials in terms of like his upbringing, his education, his training, all of that. And so Paul is a devoutly Jewish guy. And even though his mission is to go to all the Gentiles, he still loves his Jewish people. What's interesting about Paul is his missionary strategy when he goes to a new city. Typically what he will do, not always, but typically is he'll go to the synagogue first, which is like the Jewish church, and because of his Jewish credentials, they'll invite him to speak. And so he'll get up and he'll speak and he'll talk about Jesus. And what he experiences, for the most part, not universally true, but for the most part, is even though he starts telling Jewish people about Jesus, by and large, they will reject what Paul's saying and they'll reject Jesus. Like, hey, we don't think Jesus is the Son of God. We don't think he died and rose again. Like, we're done with that. Paul, get out of here. And so then Paul will go and he'll start talking to Gentiles, and he'll start predominantly Gentile churches. And so this is what Paul's going to start addressing in Romans 9, is he's going to talk about this reality that, hey, the church is rapidly becoming more and more Gentile. But Paul himself is a Jew, and he loves Jews, and even though he understands his mission to be, I'm the apostle to the Gentiles, I'm the one that's been sent to the Gentiles, I still love my own people. And what we're going to see from Paul is that it's really breaking his heart, the Jewish response to Jesus. The fact that for the most part, again, not everybody, but for the most part, Paul's own people, the Jewish people who are historically the people of God. I mean, that's what Jews have been known as historically. The first part of the Bible, called the Old Testament, is the story of ancient Israel, the rise and fall of ancient Israel. These were the people of God. And so the Jewish people in Paul's time now are kind of largely rejecting what this new thing that God is doing in and through Jesus. And so this is where Paul begins to make the transition. And so in Romans 9, verse 2, he says this. He says, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. So he starts off just with acknowledging his own pain. He says, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption to sonship. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all. And so Paul starts off by acknowledging his own heartbreak. Paul's saying, look, what's happening, it's crushing me, that I would literally give up everything of myself if my own people would embrace Jesus as God in the flesh and his death and resurrection. And Jesus is the means by which God is saving all of creation. And Paul goes on and talks about it a little more. And as Paul talks about it a little more, you understand that Paul is not just addressing this because it's breaking his heart. Paul's also talking about this because the current situation raises a pretty big question for the Christians in Rome that Paul's writing to. Because here's the thing, Paul has spent the first 8 chapters of Romans talking about Christian faith, which is rooted in God, and God is good, and God is faithful, and God is just, and God is loving, and God is kind. Now the question that gets raised is, if God is so faithful, and if God is so good, and if God is so loving, and if God is so kind, why have his own people rejected him? Paul, you just spent all this time telling us how amazing God is and how his love for us is overflowing and it's all great, and that the God who was God of Israel and Moses' God and all that stuff in the Old Testament, that God ultimately came down to earth in the person of Jesus, and he died and rose again, and it's the same God. If he's so great, why did his own people reject him? And what you have to understand is the church in Rome is made up of both Jews and Gentiles. There's both of them there. And so this is a question that people would have. You would have Jews that were a part of the church that were probably heartbroken like Paul and thinking like, why are our own people rejecting it? But you also have Gentiles who are asking this question in their mind, even if they wouldn't say it out loud, of, well, Paul, you spent all this time talking about how great God is. Why would his own people abandon him if he's so great? And so Paul's reason for discussing this is both. He's sharing his own heart, but 2, he's also answering this question. And so what Paul's going to do is he's actually going to go back in Israel's history, and he's going to use Israel's history to make the argument that listen, God hasn't failed. That just because Jewish people, by and large, are rejecting Jesus doesn't mean God has failed. Because what Paul points out here is interesting. Paul goes, look, I understand that the Jewish people, that they were the first ones that God chose. And I think sometimes we have to remember that God didn't choose Israel, he created Israel. When God created Israel, it wasn't like he went to like a group of people and said, I like you better than everyone else, I'm choosing you. Israel was created out of Abraham and Sarah, who were barren. So he takes this barren couple, and out of this barren couple creates a people that are his people. And they become the nation of Israel. And so this is why Paul says, he goes, look, I get, they were the ones that were first adopted as the people of God. They were the ones that got the temple where God lived. They were the ones that got the law through Moses. I understand all of that. And out of Israel, ultimately, by the way, is where Jesus came from. Jesus was a part of, and so I get that it looks bad. That like, why these people who seem to have gotten everything from God, why are they now rejecting God? And so this is the question Paul's going to ask. And Paul's going to make the point that, hey, God has not failed. Okay, God, just because by and large Jewish people in the first century are rejecting Jesus doesn't mean that God has failed. And not only that, but Paul's going to make the argument that the work that God was doing in Israel, the work that God was doing when he called Abraham, the work that God was doing through Moses, all that stuff in the Old Testament, it's continuing on today. That what God is doing through Jesus is not like a whole different thing. Not like God that got to the end of Israel and was like, well, that didn't work out. Let's try plan B. And Paul's going to say, no, it's all been one plan. God's all been working toward the same goal. It's all a continuation of the same thing. The work that began in Israel, God is still doing today through the church. So if you go to verse 6, here's what Paul says. He says, it's not as though God's word had failed. For not all who are descendants from Israel are Israel. Nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. In other words, it is not the children by physical descent who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. And so this is where Paul begins his point. And Paul's point is this. When God comes to Abraham, he makes promises to Abraham. One of those promises is all people on earth will be blessed through you, and I'm going to make you descendants that are as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And he makes that promise to Abraham and Sarah. Like I told you, Abraham and Sarah were barren, and so they didn't have any kids. They didn't think they were able to have kids. It takes a long time for God to fulfill that promise. As Abraham and Sarah are waiting, they get tired of waiting. Abraham ends up sleeping with another lady. She gets pregnant, has a kid. His name is Ishmael. And Ishmael is Abraham's biological son. But then God fulfills his promise to Abraham and Sarah get pregnant, and they have Isaac. And here's Paul's point. Paul's saying, listen, Abraham has 2 flesh and blood sons. But only one of them was the promised son. That doesn't make him better. It doesn't mean Ishmael's bad or anything like that. Paul's making the point that, listen, God promised Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Hagar, like, okay, they had a kid, and that kid's legitimate, but this isn't like, this was the promise. And so the point that Paul makes, he says, listen, even way back in Israel, even from Israel's earliest days, being a part of the people of God was never about like your genes and your ethnicity. Being a part of the people from God from the very beginning was always about being a part of the promises and the purpose of God. That's what it was. Because Abraham had 2 kids, but only one of them followed the purpose and promise. The other one didn't. And so this is the point Paul's making. Look, from the very beginning, it was never just about like one ethnic group of people that was God's people and everyone else. No. The people of God from the very start were always those people who lived according to the promises, and the purposes of God. That's what makes the people of God the people of God. And he uses a few more examples from Israel's history to make that point. That it was never just about like, hey, you didn't just have to have these genes. It was always rooted in the promises and the purpose of God. And then he says, verse 22 of chapter 9, it's kind of confusing. This part's kind of confusing, but hang with it because Paul's making a really good point. He says, what if? So now that he's made this point that, hey, it was never about ethnicity, it was always about purposes and promises. So what if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath prepared for destruction? What if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory, even us, whom he also called not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles? Now, I know some of us are going, okay, I understand all the words, but I have no idea what it means. It sounds like Dr. Seuss. You read it and you're like, I don't get that. Here's the point Paul's making, and he's just raising this question. He's saying, follow me. What if, because this probably never occurred to a lot of Paul's audience. Paul's saying, did you ever stop to think that the reason that God chose the people of Israel, because in Paul's day they're called Jewish, before that they were known as the people of Israel, before that they were even Hebrews, one way of referring to all the same group. Paul says, did it ever occur to you that the reason God chose the people of Israel was to the benefit of the Gentiles? That God's goal was never, hey, I'm going to choose these people and then destroy all these other people. Because again, One of the promises God makes to Abraham is all people on earth will be blessed through you. So what if God choosing the people of Israel is to the benefit of the Gentiles? That part of the mission of the people of Israel is ultimately to bring restoration and healing and salvation to the Gentiles. And then Paul goes on and says, if that's true, then the opposite is also true. So what if now what God is doing among the Gentiles and life with God that all you Gentiles are experiencing, what if part of that is ultimately to the benefit of the Jewish people? What if this is the means by which God is trying to bring the Jewish people back to himself? And again, Paul's making his argument that look, it's never just about one person or one people, that yes, there are moments in time where God works with this person or these people or this group, but it's never to the exclusion of everyone else. God's goal, God's desire, God's plan has always been universal. So even when you go back to the people of Israel in the Old Testament, to the kingdom of Israel, it was never just about them. God wasn't saving them and getting ready to destroy everyone else. He was saving them so that they could be a part of saving everyone else. And now that the situation seems to have reversed, and you have the Jewish people that are rejecting Jesus, and Gentiles are now coming to Jesus, and the church is largely Gentile. What if the same thing is true, just in reverse? And this now is the means by which God is trying to bring the Jewish people back to himself. Again, Paul's trying to widen their thinking to just say, look, you're falling into these categories of it's us versus them, it's them or them. Paul says, no, it was never, ever, ever about them and them. It was always about all of us. God's desire, God's plan to save his creation has always been universal. And then Paul goes on and he says, look, the other thing is, it's not like every Jew has abandoned God. Paul's like, look at me, I'm Jewish. I'm Jewish. I'm out here getting beat and put in jail and threatened because of my commitment to Jesus. And Paul even refers to this remnant, that there's a remnant of the people of Israel that believe in Jesus, that have dedicated their life to following Jesus, that are working with Paul to start these churches all over the Roman world. So even just to make the comment that like, hey, the Jewish people have all abandoned the work of God, Paul's saying that's not even true. There is a remnant of us. But Paul goes on, he says, and look, even though, yes, largely the Jewish response to Jesus has been rejection, God has not abandoned the Jewish people. See, as people, we tend to abandon people pretty quickly. Someone does something wrong, someone turns on us, we're done with you. Paul says that's not how God works. Even though they're by and large rejecting Jesus, God is not abandoning the Jewish people. Verse 11, here it says, he said, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all, with this exclamation point. Not at all, no. They're not beyond the grace of God. They're not beyond saving. They're not lost forever. God has not turned his back and abandoned his own children. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches their full inclusion will bring. And this is what Paul makes this point. He goes, listen, you all need to understand something. You all Gentiles who are enjoying life with God and you're enjoying being part of the work of God and what God is doing in the person of Jesus, the only reason you are there is because of the Jewish people. That your work is built on the foundation that started with them. And see, this is what Paul does here. One of the things that Paul does here that I think is so helpful even for us today. Because again, we talked about how the Old Testament is the story of Israel, kind of the rise and fall of Israel. And Israel somewhat rebuilds a little bit at the end of the Old Testament, but not very much. So you have the story of the rise and fall of Israel. And then the New Testament, the second part of the Bible, picks up with Jesus and his movement that ultimately becomes known as the church. And sometimes I think when we look at it, it's like these seem like two different things. The Old Testament is also known as the Hebrew Bible, which is those scriptures that are sacred to Judaism. And the church, for the most part, based most of what we do on the New Testament, and they just seem so incredibly different. And so sometimes it's easy for us to look at it and go, well, yeah, God tried here and that didn't work, so he did something totally different. And one of the big points that Paul's making is, no, he didn't. He didn't. That what God started in Israel, what began with Abraham, is still going on in the church, in the New Testament. That Jesus was not this deviation to like, plan A didn't work, let's do something else. That it was always going toward Jesus. This is why the New Testament writers will talk about how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. When they say that, they're not saying that everything the Old Testament says is ultimately about Jesus. What they're saying is everything that God said he was going to do in the Old Testament, he ultimately accomplished in Jesus. Jesus is the continuation of Israel, and then ultimately the church is a continuation of Jesus. So it's all this coherent thing. It's all God, and his goal has always been the universal restoration and salvation of his creation. And so again, at this point, he's looking at the Gentiles and he's saying, the only reason that you are standing as a part of the church right now, the only reason that you are experiencing life with God is because of the Jewish people. You are living off of their foundation, what they built when they were slaves in Egypt, when they were walking through the wilderness as Moses was leading them, when they settled down in the land of Israel, and all that stuff that they worked through, all the difficulties, all the challenges, all the defeats, what they built in terms of faith and connection to God, you are literally standing on the foundation that they have built. And Paul's going to go on and he uses this fascinating image as he talks about grafted branches. Now, I don't know much about gardening, mainly because everything that I plant dies. Like I don't know what I do wrong. I blame the soil at our house, but I'm pretty sure it's me. It all dies. We water it, there's sprinkles, it just all dies. And so I don't know much about gardening. I don't know much about grafting, but I did Google it a little bit just to see. Grafting, when you talk about grafting is kind of a way of creating a hybrid plant, because what you do is you take one plant and you cut off one of its branches and attach the branch of a different kind of plant in such a way that they will grow together and they will continue to grow. Here's a picture of kind of one way that grafting plants looks like. And you can see they have cut this branch of this tree here, and now what they've done is they've stuck these other branches from a totally different kind of tree into this existing tree in such a way that they will continue to grow. So now you'll have these branches that come out of this tree that are different from all these other branches. And so Paul makes a point, talking to Gentiles, he says, listen, you all are grafted branches is what you are. You're grafted branches that are attached to the foundation of Israel. What God began to do, he began to do in Israel. And he has now brought you into that. So don't look on the Jewish people with disdain or anything. You're only here because of them. And this is also this powerful image because God is saying, Paul's saying, don't you understand what God is doing? Is God is creating this new plant, this new tree. God's creating this new community, this new people, this new family that is diverse. It's not all the same kind. We don't all look the same. We don't all talk the same. We don't all sound the same. And God has grafted this together through his own death and resurrection. That this is what the church is. This church is this grafted family that God is bringing together from all these different backgrounds. And in the past, you may have said, oh, these things can't go together. In Jesus, they do go together. And Paul goes on to make the point and says, and Gentiles, before you get too cocky, just remember this. He grafted you into this branch, and you're a completely different kind of tree. That's a difficult thing to do. Super easy to graft branches of the same kind of tree back into the tree, which is what God wants to do with the Jewish people. They may have been cut off, and you may have been grafted in. And that's all part of God's plan and his design. But he also wants to graft the Jewish people back into the tree that they started. And so Paul gives us what is this, really, I think it's a really cool and this powerful image. Using these grafted branches, saying this is what God is doing, and this has always been the goal. That the Old Testament and the New Testament are not these separate stories of a different God up to different things. That it's this one story of what God has been up to. That the work of Jesus is a continuation of what started with Abraham and Moses, and the work of the church is a continuation of Jesus, which is a continuation of Moses and of Abraham. When Paul writes another letter in the New Testament to a church in Corinth, the book of 2 Corinthians, and here's what he writes to the church in Corinth. He says this in 2 Corinthians, he says, for no matter how many promises God has made, they are yes in Christ. Paul says that every promise God made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Moses, to Ruth, to Esther, to any of David, Solomon, any of them, every promise God made to Israel, he fulfilled in Jesus. And Jesus then gave that mission on to the church. It's not separate things. We're all connected. And what God is doing is he's creating this one family of diverse backgrounds. That's why when you get to Revelation, it's one family of every tribe, nation, and tongue before God singing together. The goal was always universal. God never played favorites. Even when he may have been working with this person or this group, it was never to the exclusion of everyone else. The goal was always the benefit of everyone. So Paul's reminding the Gentiles, he's saying, listen, you should be grateful to the Jewish people. And this ultimately comes down, now we're going to see what it is that Paul's really trying to navigate and why he spends so much time on this. Because here's what he says in chapter 11, verse 25. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles has come in, and in this way, all Israel will be saved. Now, I want to make this point really clear. This is not Paul making a prophecy. A lot of people like this go, this is Paul prophesying. This is Paul sharing his heart. And Paul's saying, here's my hope. My hope is that even though by and large my fellow Jews have turned away from Jesus, my hope is that they will turn back. And Paul says, and I think the reason they will turn back is because of the Gentiles. And Paul tells the Gentiles, he says, I don't want you to get conceited. I don't want you to be arrogant. I don't want you to think you're better. See, the interesting thing about the situation in Rome is for the most part, early churches, because it began out of Judaism, they were led by Jews, and then you had Gentiles who were struggling to be a part of them. The Roman church is actually the opposite, because several years before Paul wrote this letter, the Roman emperor kicked all the Jews out of Rome, forced them all to leave. So all the Jews left, and so all of a sudden the church that was both Jews and Gentiles becomes strictly Gentiles. A few years later, the emperor allows the Jews to come back, so you have Jews that come back into Rome, but now they come back into a Gentile-led church. So the situation in Rome is you have a Gentile-led church with Jews who are trying to be a part of it, and they're trying to figure it out, and it's a messy situation. The number one issue the early church deals with is division. And it's primarily between Jews and Gentiles. And it manifests itself in all different kinds of arguments. Like if you read the other New Testament, they argue over holidays and how you celebrate holidays. They argue over what kind of food you should eat or not eat. They argue over circumcision. So they have all of these issues, but the central, where they all stem from is they all stem from this Jew and Gentile divide. That there's this division that kind of threatens the church. And what's fascinating about Paul is Paul throughout his life wears a lot of different hats. He's a church planner, he's a missionary, he's a theologian, but what you see in the middle part of Romans is you see Paul the pastor. Because Paul is trying to work with this church to help them in the midst of this divisive and historic issue of tension. And so in the midst of all of this tension and all of these feelings, and it's like, well, we feel superior because we're the historic people of God. Yeah, but you've rejected God. Or Paul's trying to how do we navigate this as a healthy church? So again, what you see is Paul navigating that, but you see his heart as he does that for both Jews and Gentiles. And how do we come together when everything about us is kind of pulling us apart? I want to get pastoral for a minute. I say that, and I'm going to share with you a picture right now that doesn't look pastoral at all, but just hang with me here. We're going to get there. I love Marvel movies. I do. It's like my son and I, it's our thing. When a new Marvel movie comes out, we go and see it. Thor is my favorite Marvel hero of all time. I love Thor. But another one that I really like, it's one of my son's favorite, is Spider-Man. Big Spider-Man fan. And I remember the first Spider-Man standalone movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe was Spider-Man Homecoming. We were actually in Texas with our family when we went and saw it, and it was fun. It was a fun, enjoyable movie. There's a scene in that movie, and I'm going to put a picture up, and this is a picture from that. There's a scene where Spider-Man is out in the harbor. He lives in New York. He's out in the harbor, and he's on this, it's a boat, but it's a ferry. And there's this weird alien technology, and as you can see, the ferry ends up getting cut in half by this laser thing, and there's people on both sides, and the ferry is sinking because you have these two sides that are now falling apart, and it's sinking. And Spider-Man does this cool thing where he comes down the middle, and he shoots his webs all over the place, and he's trying with every ounce of strength that he has to hold this thing together to keep it from sinking, because it's literally ripping itself apart. This is a bit what it's like in churches these days. No, we live, before I say that, I'm not advocating that I'm Spider-Man at all, by the way. I'm not advocating that I'm the one that holds the church together. That's not my point at all. But what I'm saying is, we live in a culture that is incredibly divided. And sadly, there are some statistics that show that on some certain issues, there's actually more division inside the church than there is outside the church. And so we live in this, and really, we could go through and make a list of all of these, like, all the issues. Like, there's this issue, there's that issue, there's this issue. But if we're honest with ourselves, and don't get mad at me when I say this, and please hear me out no matter what you think, even if you want to come up on stage and beat me up. Most of it stems from our political ideologies. Okay, so in Paul's day, you had people arguing over all of these different things. You had people arguing, like I said, over circumcision and holidays and you know, but most of it stemmed from there's this Jew and Gentile divide. Like, that's where it kind of all came from. Again, you could say the same thing about us. We have all these, it's this, it's this, it's this. But a lot of it stems from our political ideologies. And depending on which side we fall on, depends on what stance we take on any specific given issue, and it kind of dictates the arguments and how we're kind of pulling apart. And so the reality of the American church is exactly this picture. That you have people on different sides, and they're pushing and pulling away from each other because they have these very, very differing political ideologies, and it's literally tearing the church apart. And this is why the church in our culture and the church in our country, this is why it's sinking and failing. Not because of anything out there, but because of what's happening in here. Because our division is killing us. Now, one of my heroes is a guy named Leslie Newbigin. And here's a picture of Leslie Newbigin. Leslie Newbigin was a British guy, born in Britain, educated in Britain. And in the 1930s, he left his home in Britain and he went over to India. And he served as a missionary in India for 40 years. And then he came back home to his native Britain in the 70s. Now, I was not alive between the 30s and the 70s. Some of you may have been. But even if you weren't, I was born in the late 70s. But anyway, even if you weren't, I just want you to think of what you know about history. Think how much the world changed between the 1930s and the 1970s. Just think about how different that is. So what's interesting that happens in Newbigin's life is he leaves Britain in the 30s, serves as a faithful missionary for 40 years, comes back home to Britain in the 70s, and is like, this is not even the same place that I left. It's a drastically different world. And so what Newbigin does is he spends the later years of his life really writing about how to help the church in the Western world, not just Britain, but what we call the Western world. How to help the church in the Western world navigate the new reality in which it finds itself. And so he writes all these books. They're still read today. And what's crazy is he wrote these like in the 70s, 80s, maybe a little bit in the 90s. But now when you read them, they sound like prophecy. Like back then, it was just him kind of sharing like, hey, here's my observations, here's what I think. But now it's like, man, he was right. And one of the things that Newbigin noted is he noted that in the Western world, as the church was losing influence and as like church attendance was declining and all that stuff, there was like a passion or a zeal for faith and religion that in the past, that's what we used to fight over. But Paul's like, Leslie Newbigin's like, that's kind of leaving. And what's replacing it is politics. Is that politics now becomes the new religion in the Western world. And Newbigin did not mix words when he warned the church. He said, listen, you as a church in the Western world, you better be really, really careful. In one of his books, he wrote, Foolishness to the Greeks. I want to share with you two quotes that he said, because they're crazy. Here's what he said. He said, confusion of a particular and fallible set of political and moral judgments with the cause of Jesus Christ is more dangerous than the open rejection of the claim of Christ in Islam. Again, I'm not saying you have to agree with him. This is not the gospel. This is not Jesus. But Newbigin's point is he said, listen, if you say that your political viewpoint, whatever it is, your political party, your political ideology, if that is the only God-ordained one, Newbigin argued that's actually more dangerous than just outright rejecting Jesus. Then he also said, the sacralizing of politics to the total identification of a political goal with the will of God always unleashed demonic powers. He went through history and he said, if you look at any point in history and you look at when one political ideology claimed that we are God's political ideology, every single instance, what it did was ultimately unleash evil. Now, don't hear Newbigin wrong. Newbigin never made the case that Christian people should never be involved in politics. He didn't. In fact, he argued the opposite. It's like, no, as Christian people, we should be involved in politics. Politics is how our society is governed. It's how it structures. It's how it's functioned. Like, you absolutely should be. But Newbigin also understood that you could have devout, God-fearing, loving Christians that had different viewpoints across the political spectrum. And what Newbigin was warning of is really, honestly, exactly where we've ended up. Newbigin said, because here's the problem. When you talk about politics, politics has one goal: to defeat your opponent. That's it. You have one political ideology, there's another political ideology, and the goal of those political ideologies is to defeat this other. Politics always creates enemies. That's what it does. In every single instance, it creates enemies. Christian faith has no enemies. Look at what Jesus says about enemies. What does he say about enemies? Love your neighbor. Pray for those who persecute you. Jesus, as he's dying on the cross and people are cursing for him, and people are like cursing at his death and cheering for his death, what does he say? Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. Christian faith has no enemies. It never creates us versus them categories. And so this is what Newbigin's warning. He says, listen, when you intertwine your politics with your faith, you create enemies out of the very people God is trying to save. And so what ends up happening is inadvertently we end up working against God because we are trying to defeat people that Jesus is trying to save. And it's really hard to work toward loving and saving someone when all you're doing is trying to defeat them. And so this was Newbigin's warning. What Newbigin understood is what Paul was getting at in the middle part of Romans. And I'm going to put it on the screen because I want us to see it. The greatest threat to the mission of the church is disunity. The greatest threat to the church accomplishing its mission doesn't come from outside. It doesn't come from culture. I'm not saying there aren't things out there that aren't messed up. I'm not saying there aren't things out there but what I'm saying is the greatest threat to us as a church from accomplishing our mission, from being a part of what God is doing to save and restore all of creation is within us. It's our own disunity. This is what Paul understood. And Paul understood this because Jesus said it. Jesus told his followers, the whole purpose of the church is to bear witness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and the difference that makes in our life. That's the goal. That you want to sum it up as easy as you can. The church exists to bear witness to the world of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus and what difference that makes. And Jesus said there's one way you can do that. And he told his followers on the night that he was arrested, John 13:35, this is what he told them. He said, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. That's the only way you can do it. And it's really hard to love someone that you're trying to defeat. And so when you look at what Paul's doing in Romans 9, this is what he's trying to do. He's trying to help this church navigate. Man, here's this issue of division. How do we not let it divide us? And how do we come together? How do we be this grafted plant that God is making of taking all these different people and putting us together? And even though we're not the same, and none of us are better than any others, and God's goal is ultimately the salvation and restoration of all of us. He's not trying to defeat any of us. It's all of us. The church in this country is sinking and dying, not because of what's happening out there, but because of what's happening in here. I'm going to put that Spider-Man picture back up. The only way this changes is if those of us on either side choose to lean in toward one another instead of pushing each other away. Now listen, we didn't get here overnight. I know a lot of times we look back and go, oh, it's a COVID thing, or oh, it's this thing. Or this reality has been happening in our culture and in churches for like centuries. You can trace it back to all of these developments and how we got to where we are. So we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of this overnight. It's going to take work, and it's going to take intentionality. But the only way it gets better is if those of us on these sides, I'm not trying to convince you to think like them. I'm not trying to convince you to hold this. But I'm saying if we can choose to lean into each other, This is what Paul was trying to get the Jews and Gentiles to do. Don't think you're superior. Don't think you're better. Don't try to conquer each other. Don't try to defeat. Lean into one another and become the grafted plant that God is trying to make out of all of us. We have to choose to begin to lean into one another in spite of our differences. Because if we don't, this ship is going to sink even faster than it already is. I want to leave you with a couple quotes from people that I respect. I actually saw these on social media. There are good things on social media. Bob Goff, he said this. He said, "Don't let being right talk you out of being kind." Second one comes from Andy Stanley, who's a pastor in Atlanta, and he said this. He said, "When a local church becomes preoccupied with saving America at the expense of saving Americans, it has forsaken its mission." Oftentimes, unintentionally, we end up working against God. Because in our own desire to be right, we are trying to defeat people that He is trying to save. Look, I know we live in a crazy time. And I know things aren't easy to navigate. And believe me, I'm not trying to sit up here and tell you, oh, it's easy. It's not easy. It's not. There's no quick fix. But if we're going to begin, then we've got to make the choice to start leaning in instead of pushing away. We've got to make a choice to see people, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a brother and sister to love. And we've got to choose to become the grafted plant that God is trying to build us into. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. I thank you that you came down to this earth in the person of Jesus, and you gave your life. You gave your life to ultimately restore and save your creation. And through your death and resurrection, God, you are making a new family and a new humanity and a new way of life. And God, I know that we so often hold on to the old ways because it's easier and it seems more comfortable. And God, what I know when I look around and I see, I'm just not just talking about FCC, I'm talking about friends I know who are pastors all over this country, and just watch how as a church, man, we're just devouring ourselves. And it breaks my heart, and Father, I know it breaks yours, because this is not what you dreamed of when you talked about the church. God, I pray that in the midst of all of the anger and all of the hurt and all of the frustration and all of the disagreement, that we could make the choice to begin to lean in toward one another. Instead of pushing each other away, we would lean in. And it took us a long time to get here, and it's probably going to take us a long time to get out. But it's worth the struggle. Father, help us to be the kind of church you dreamed about. We love you and we thank you, and we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.